In the last few years, we have seen scandals within the church, both on a denominational level, all the way down to individual pastors. And back when I was in seminary, I remember being given this specific cautionary warning that there are three things that take out even the best pastors if they aren't careful and watchful. And those are the desire for power, pleasure, and deep pockets. And based on what has been going on lately, I would say, yeah, that warning was and still is spot on. While we see in the scriptures commands to flee from sexual immorality and a call to walk in all humility instead of chase power, when it comes to money, there have been different takes and understandings of what the Bible has to say, leading many people to ask the question, should pastors be paid? In this video, we are going to examine the scriptures that many would cite for reasons to give or not to give to your pastors and other common objections like these, and find out what is true, my personal thoughts on the subject, and if you should be tithing and helping to keep a pastor's salary going or not. All that and more is coming up right after this. Let me start this video off by pointing out the obvious. For those who are returning viewers who know me and watch me, yes, I am a full-time vocational pastor, meaning my main source of income comes from working and doing ministry at a church. Now, to some, they might feel that that compromises me on looking at this objectively and fairly, but I think it actually does the opposite. It helps me a bit be more qualified to speak on the realities of what pastors do and don't do, the sacrifices many ministry families make to serve the church, and the reality of understanding a side of the church that many either don't want to think about or acknowledge even exists. All that to say, I desire to really look at some of the leading objections on why some people, Christians and non, believe pastors shouldn't be paid, and address them in the best and most gracious, unbiased way I know how. I want to start by looking at the objection that pastoring is not a real job, and that if you get into ministry, you are doing it for the Lord and not to get rich. Now let's start by addressing the first part, that is pastoring not being a real job. And to this, I would say you are absolutely right. It's not a real job. It's about at least 10 different real jobs that change daily, because while yes, preaching and teaching are part of that role, and it is what a majority of people think a pastor does because it's the most visible part of their job, there is a variety of other tasks that need to be done within the confines of the church. Some that are related and would be presumed under the umbrella of pastoring, such as hospital visits or counseling, wedding, teaching classes, and doing funerals. But there are way more than that most people who haven't worked at a church would probably never even think about, such as plumbing issues, accounting, managing team, event planning, outreach coordination, being a fundraiser, an appraiser, operations manager, tech director, teams coordinator, intermediary, recruiter, stage designer, worship leader, repairing lights, repairing tech, repairing parking lots. You get the picture. A lot of maintenance and a lot of handiwork. And if you think, well, why not just outsource all those things to professionals? Well, that's where the understanding that most churches don't make a lot of money comes into play. A recent study revealed that out of 15,000 churches, 7 out of 10 of them had fewer than 100 people attend weekly to their worship services. On average, they found that only 65 churchgoers attend the median-sized church each week. Putting that into perspective, that means that over half of all churches have fewer than 65 people in their weekly worship service. Even if all those people gave, which let me tell you from experience right now that that is not the case, do you think that that's enough to fairly pay a pastor doing all of those things we just named, or even be able to pay multiple individuals doing those things? I don't know if you've ever had someone come and paint your house or fix a pipe, but let me tell you, those services aren't cheap. As for someone saying you shouldn't get into ministry to get rich, but to serve the Lord, my guess would be that they're thinking of people and tactics that usually fall under things like prosperity gospel. You know the kind, the televangelist that would tell you to put your hand on the screen if you want to be healed right now, but only after purchasing your specific holy water from them that's supposedly from Jerusalem, and making a charitable large tithe to them and their ministry that you really don't have, but you're doing it anyways, putting it on a credit card to show your faith and trust in God. If you can't tell, I am mocking these things because yes, I think we would all agree on the sentiment that those things are wrong and evil. The Bible even says that the love of money is the root of all evil. So right there seems like scripture is pretty clear, and these prosperity gospel practices are evident of why the scriptures warn against this kind of practices. practices. But it's important to understand that the love of money and the need for money are very different. And scripture has a lot to say about earning a fair wage, especially when it comes to pastors and elders. One of the most common passages is 1 Timothy 5:17, which says, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages." This idea is to say that whatever we would normally think of paying, they, as in pastors and teachers, are worthy of doubling that. See, it's not that having money or working for money and working for the Lord are these mutually exclusive ideas, or that making money while in ministry is wrong, but rather it's not using the Lord's name in vain and using God as this blanket cover to your get-rich scheme or your laziness, which, let me tell you right now, most pastors I know are not lazy. The reality is, though, that there are few that could actually afford to be full-time vocational pastors without having some other kind of side gig, or are just bivocational, not because there isn't enough work to do, but because the church can't pay them a realistic, fair living. And in reality, it would be easy to just not pay a pastor at all to cover the rest of the things, but this passage is here to remind us to see it as a value, to try and strive to pay a pastor a fair compensation, and see them as people we need to have in the church and be investing in. To not muzzle the ox that plows and works your fields, but allow them to eat so they don't have to worry about where their food will come from, but support them because they worked for it. But it's not just there we see the scriptures talk about money or even paying a minister specifically, but we will be getting into that as we look at this next objection, because maybe you just heard me talk about all those things a pastor does and you are saying to the screen right now or thinking in your head, that's because you have a building, and buildings are expensive, and with that comes expenses. And the modern church now is not functioning like a church anymore, but more like a business. And the church was never meant to be a business, because didn't Jesus flip out and flip tables at the people selling in the temple trying to make a profit? So that is another reason why we shouldn't pay pastors. Okay. To start, Mark 11:15-17 is where we see that specific story about Jesus flipping out for three very specific reasons. Number one, the money chargers turned what was supposed to be God's house of prayer into a full-on marketplace. Now, from that reason, you might go, see, that's it. That's why we shouldn't do this. The church is not meant to be a business. But what I mean when I say that is that it wasn't just a place providing necessary services and charging a fair price for these items, but that much like a common marketplace of that time, the practice was trying to get as much out of someone as possible. Hence the den of robbers comment by Jesus. It was taking advantage of people, greedy merchants, cheating their buyers if they could, especially during feasts and other huge gatherings where people would come together for festivals. But it was also that the religious leaders were overseeing and allowing these kinds of practices to take place in the house of worship, and that the people of God were the ones being taken advantage of. That was part of the real issue Jesus was angry. The second reason Jesus was angry and mad and started flipping furniture was because the marketplace removed the ability for Gentiles, the people who didn't know God or didn't grow up hearing about God, from being able to learn and worship and grow and hear about the God of Israel. The Jewish leaders turned the location into a place for sales only, when the outer courts of the temple were designed and built specifically for those outside the Jewish faith. But because of the trading and marketing taking place, this wasn't possible and able to happen. Reason number three Jesus was angry was because the space was used as a shortcut route to get around the city and not as a place of worship. They were not respecting God's intended purposes and function of the outer courts. Why does this matter to our conversation on paying pastors or not? Because again, what this passage shows is not that making money is wrong or that business is even wrong, but it's understanding God's intended purpose and function of all things, including buildings. Because it wasn't about having a temple that was wrong. In fact, God has so much to say in the Old Testament about the temple, down to the size, design, and much more, showing that a building and space to worship, learn, and grow in God is actually really important to Him and for us. But in this case, it's how the space was being used and improper business practices that made Jesus angry, not the services or the business aspect of the temple itself. In fact, I would go so far as to say that churches should care about business, because we are involved in the most important business there is, God's business. I know that the word business in and of itself seem to be like oil and water, something we should keep separate from one another and never interact with each other. But the reality is, in order to have a church that has a space for gathering alone, get for a second even paying a pastor, requires money. This isn't a bad thing either, but it's just a reality of our world and why the Bible spends a decent amount of time talking about this. And if you're thinking, well, this is why we should just go back to what Acts did and have house churches and people should just gather in homes, I love that thought and sentiment. So let me ask you, have you opened your home personally to let that happen weekly? Are your doors always open and unlocked for anyone in need? Or run other weekly ministries outside of the Sunday service for men, women, and children so that their ministries can meet out of your house as well? And if you're not the one called to teach or lead, and if your answer is yes, and you've done any of these things even once before, you understand pretty quickly the reality of upkeep weekly gatherings costs. Cost of electricity, water, working bathrooms, the resources needed just to keep your house running. It could start to get really expensive really fast. And where would that money come from? My point being is we are called as believers to gather together. It is a good thing. And regardless if it's in a big church building or a home, in order to operate and maintain these spaces costs money, including having a pastor, someone to oversee and care for those in his flock. So having business aspects in terms of budgeting and doing accounting aren't bad things at all for churches. In fact, it's being good stewards of the resources God entrusts to us, both in our churches and in our homes. This is one of the reasons why God commands and speaks of tithes and offerings to be a part of the believers' lives and worship. Because just as you go and do your job and expect to get paid for your time, skill sets, and efforts, so should a pastor. But ministry is supposed to be different, some might say, and point to a passage in scripture and the Apostle Paul as proof. This is the third objection that some people would use, that Paul is the example, that Paul shows that we shouldn't be charging people to hear the gospel. And in this objection, for reasons why not to pay a pastor, they will point to 1 Corinthians 9:18, which says, "What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel." It would seem like Paul is arguing for pastors to follow his example and not charge others for his work of the gospel. Paul was a tent maker after all and prided himself on not taking money from this church. So what is going on here then? What is the right answer? Again, I'll start by saying context matters. 1 Corinthians 9:1, Paul opens up this chapter by saying, "Am I not free?" Meaning, don't I deserve to be paid fairly for the work that I do? And says that those reading the letters in Corinth are literally the result of his work, time, and effort to bring the gospel to them. And then he goes on to say this in verse 3. "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cyprus? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" Paul gets personal here, and the whole objection and notion of ministry being different from other jobs and not deserving of pay is wrong. It is a right that Paul and any other fruitful pastor has to be paid for their work. And if those pastors are married, just as much a right and expectation to care for their spouses as well. This is why he asks, or is it only those in ministry this understanding should be applied to? Only Barnabas and I who don't have these rights. He even compares it to other jobs people have in that time in the following verses by saying, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more?" Man, I feel like I don't even really have to explain anything here. Paul just lays it out so clearly that for anyone to see and think and say pastors shouldn't or aren't deserving of pay because Paul didn't take a pay has never really read all of Paul's teaching. We see him bring up the passage here that we mentioned earlier in the video, and he even explains it in better context, that God gave that command for the teachers and preachers, for those in ministry. So then, what is the point of what Paul is saying here a few verses later in verse 18? Well, Paul is saying he is glad that he was in a position where he didn't have to charge that specific church for the ministry work that he did with them. That he didn't have to be a burden or another expense for that church to have to figure out, but was able to preach there freely and not make the use of the right he has to charge them. In fact, this verse does the opposite of showing pastors should not be paid. even without the context. Because what else would Paul be talking about here where he's saying that he isn't using the full right of? What would the full right be? So again, there is an understanding according to Paul and a right we see in scripture and in our world to pay those who do a job, especially those in ministry. Generosity is something we are supposed to be leading our lives with as believers, both for those attending church as well as those working in one. A good friend of mine once said that we never look more like Jesus than when we give. And I would personally love to be able to grow this YouTube channel to a place where I could give in the same way that Paul does and follow in his example and continue to do ministry in the online space as well as in the local church without having to take a salary and be a burden to them. So if you enjoy this video, do me a favor and like the video and consider subscribing to help make that a reality. There is so much more that could be said on this topic, like should pastors then tithe on their own church salary? And does having a full-time pastor then stunt the growth of a church? And if you want to know the answer to those questions, I encourage you to check out this video right over here where me and some other pastor friends have a longer conversation and discussion on that video. Special thank you to my wife and all other pastors' wives and families that stand by and support their spouse in ministry without receiving a check. Your sacrifices don't go unnoticed, and you are the real unsung heroes. But until next time, know that you are valued and loved, and I'll see you soon.